Today, immediately following worship, we're going to have our second sermon talk back. So right after worship, you'll be invited to come forward, sit in the first few pews, and talk about the sermon. But don't talk back now, okay? A pastor colleague of mine recently told me an unbelievable story. He said a visitor to worship at his church called him a few days after she'd visited to thank him for healing her. You heard it, he told me incredulously, healing her. Baffled at what the woman was saying, my colleague asked the visitor what she meant. She explained that right as he had begun pronouncing the benediction the previous Sunday, a warm feeling came over her, starting right at her head, going all the way down to her toes. And she felt healed. And she claims it's true. She actually was healed from whatever it was she was ailing from. Now, I can't tell you the name of this colleague because A, I do not believe that he is capable of such a thing, at least on a regular basis. And B, I do not want you running off to worship somewhere else just because you think you're catching a cold. But I can tell you that I know this. People, everyday run-of-the-mill people come to church to be healed, to have experiences of grace in this place and to leave different. And that's nothing new. During the first half of the 20th century in this country, in fact, the traveling revival was better than the circus. Folks flocked in from everywhere to the revival tent because they'd heard the preacher could heal people. And they'd bring Grandma, who had been blind for 13 years, and Uncle Joe, who had a bad back, and Aunt Jessie, who couldn't seem to get the swelling in her feet to go down. And rushing to church for healing isn't a relic of the past either. Just this past Friday, in fact, in advance of what is the Eastern Orthodox Easter celebration today, the Chicago Tribune printed a story about Assumption Greek Orthodox Church in South Chicago, Homer Glen, where a statue of St. John the Baptist has been emitting droplets of fragrant oil since July. Word has spread far and wide that this oil, which the priest has been collecting with a reservoir of cotton balls at the icon's base, has healing properties. So far, the church has handed out over 5,000 pieces of oil-saturated cotton, and the stories of healing have started to trickle in. One man who was given an oil-saturated piece of cotton just prior to seeing his doctor for a heart ailment found when he got to the doctor that his heart wasn't blocked at all after all. Another reported being healed from cancer. And one congregant who stopped by to pick up some oil for an ailing family member said, at a time when everything seems to be falling apart in the world, this is so nice to see. The priest who was interviewed feels that the oil is a symbol of healing, not just for individuals, but for his little parish, torn apart by controversy and scandal just a few years before. When people see this icon, it is a reminder that God is alive and still working through us, and a reminder that there's still hope in the world for us. Assumption Church, as you might expect, is now struggling to handle the thousands of visitors who are flocking to the church because they want to be healed. Many of us come to church for healing, and many of us do find healing in these places of spiritual nurture and growth. But most often, I'm thinking, the healing doesn't steal over us like being doused with warm honey during the benediction. And the healing doesn't come usually through an oil-soaked cotton ball. Instead, healing comes from the touch of a hand, the soaring notes of a beautiful choir anthem, the grasping finally of a profound truth, the passing of the peace, the sharing of the table, the profound power of sitting next to someone who knows your name, and the joy of hearing the first notes of your favorite hymn and closing your eyes and singing at the top of your lungs. But alas, instant or gradual, neither kind of healing is reasonably predictable, at least not enough to market the service or pull in the masses or broadcast a television revival, except maybe at Assumption Church in Chicago. Still, our shared need for healing is exactly where you and I find ourselves in the story we heard from John's Gospel this morning. We're in the season of Easter now, these weeks following Easter Sunday and headed toward Pentecost. And during this season, the subject of threatening resurrection keeps coming up over and over as we read about the struggles of the first church in the book of Acts. Today's story is one of my favorites, as you might imagine. Paul wants to plant a church and he can't quite do it. So he needs the help of some women. And Lydia comes to Paul and pulls out her woman card and says, I'm going to be the pastor here. One of the first women pastors in the Bible. We're revisiting also some of these favorite gospel stories, Jesus' greatest hits. So we find ourselves today in today's gospel hurting, in search of healing, desperate for hope, and returning over and over and over to a place that we believe might heal us, only to find ourselves not miraculously healed during the benediction as we'd hoped, but caught in an increasingly familiar and comfortable pattern, stuck, unable to summon the courage to step into the threat and the promise of resurrection. Just like we can't blame Uncle Joe for dragging his bad back down to the revival tent, we certainly can't blame the sick people in John's Gospel who set up camp next to the pool of Bethesda near the Shepherd's Gate in Jerusalem. This is a real place. You can visit it today. And if you were to visit it, you would see the crumbling ruins of what was once a pool carved out of the side of the rock. It's about 53 feet long and 18 feet wide, with many steps leading down to its edge. And it's surrounded by a series of stone colonnades or porticos. Back in Jesus' day, underneath the pool ran some aqueducts that circulated the water, and every once in a while, a natural spring would gush water into the pool. If you feel like turning your pew Bibles to John chapter 5, you'll note something unusual in today's text. The text in these Bibles skips straight from verse 3 to verse 5. Verse 4 is completely left out of our version, deemed later commentary, but were it there, it would read, "For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well from whatever disease the person had." You heard it, the tradition that every once in a while the waters would become stirred up, kind of like turning on jacuzzi jets. And people believed that the first person to make it in would be healed. It must have happened sometime. Sick individuals plunging into the churning waters and experiencing healing. You might imagine there were piles off to the side of discarded crutches and wheelchairs, just to prove the point. And that's the situation Jesus encountered when he came to the pool that day. Its edges were jam-packed with people who had taken up permanent residence there, each one coming to the pool and hoping for years and years and years that they could be healed. But something started to happen to those people in the years of waiting. It seems this constant jockeying for position, the tedious competition of the hurting, the interminable waiting for the next chance, well, it got to be wearing. And the funny thing is, the people who gathered there in the holy city waiting for a miracle forgot why they'd come in the first place. They'd forgotten, and after 38 years, it's understandable, the fervor and devotion that brought them to the pool seeking healing at any cost. Instead, in their boredom and anxiety, they spent a whole lot of time dreaming up lame excuses for why their lives couldn't possibly change. And they sat there, right on the edge of resurrection, unable to jump in. This is very clear in the conversation Jesus had when he met the man who had claimed his spot on the edge of the pool for almost 40 years. He must have been pretty ensconced because the text says Jesus saw him lying there and immediately could tell that he had been there for some time. Perhaps he built a makeshift shelter, brought in an old couch. We don't know what malady afflicted this man by the pool. Tradition says that he was paralyzed. You heard from the story today, he had trouble making his way to the water. But the text just says he's ill. Whatever his trouble was, he needed to be healed. And the text says Jesus looked at him and asked him the most unexpected question. Not, how are you feeling today? Or, how long have you been here? Or, how did you get ill? Jesus said, do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well? You could just imagine the man looking up at Jesus with the most incredulous expression. What do you mean, do I want to be made well? I have been sitting here next to this pool for 38 years. I haven't had my turn to get in the water. And plus, I don't have anybody to help me. It's not fair, and it's not my fault. I've been dealt a bad hand. The miracle of healing never works for me. But Jesus had asked the question he meant to ask. Do you want to be made well? Because his next words put the onus of healing not on some mystical, miraculous luck, but on the actions of the man himself. Take up your mat and walk, Jesus said. No more sitting by the side of the pool waiting for a miracle. No more dragging yourself to the shrine sadly. No more hopeless expressions and foregone conclusions, and no more lame excuses. No more. Jesus came to the pool to wake that man up, to let him know that he was stuck, not so much by his illness, but even more profoundly by his wallowing in hopelessness and his cataloging of lame excuses. There was healing to be had, Jesus showed him, but it was going to take some cooperation on his part. In Elizabeth Gilbert's wonderful book, Eat, Pray, Love, she tells the story of a poor Italian man who goes to church every day and prays before the statue of a saint. Dear saint, please, 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 give me the grace to win the lottery. This daily, desperate prayer goes on for years and years and years. Finally, the statue comes to life, looks down at the begging man, and says in weary disgust, "My son, Please, 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 buy a ticket. For 38 years, it could have been that spot on the edge of the pool was more comfortable than reaching out and grabbing onto hope one more time. It could have been that dreaming up lame excuses for staying right there in the pain became more familiar than longing for freedom. It could have been that after all that time, the man had forgotten what he so desperately wanted in the first place, healing, and preferred instead to sit around with a whole group of people who had come to encounter a miracle, who hadn't experienced it exactly like they had hoped, and who chose instead every single day to sit right at the edge of resurrection. Their waiting flavored with anger and bitterness and destructive competition, their stamina fueled by lame excuses. There is no shame in longing for a miracle. There have been times in my life when I really could have used a miraculous release from the pain of human living, and if I had known about a shrine with a statue of St. John the Baptist sweating drops of scented oil, I might have actually gone to get my cotton ball. But most days, I long for the kind of miraculous healing contained in encountering God. And that is why we come to this place, invest in this community, and try to believe, even on our darkest days, that resurrection and healing are possible. We're all grasping for a miracle of one sort or another: the healing of our hearts, the release from pain, the mending of the world, the calming of the chaos. And if these were to happen, as they sometimes do at church, well, wouldn't that be like a miracle? And so we keep showing up, hoping for the results we want, some of us for 38 years or more. But in the process, along the way, the reality of human life in community begins to tarnish our initial hopes. We become used to a way that's comfortable, that we expect. Our unhealed realities become the norm. We settle for something less than the miraculous in our relationships with each other. We forget. We forget about the daring hope of new life that made us risk the threat of resurrection to show up in the first place. But God is not a drive-through window at McDonald's. We can't drive in here every week, plaintively lamenting our pain, wallowing in the hurt that keeps us sitting on the edge of the pool. Your former pastor, William Sloane Coffin, wrote, "I think the central problem of the Christian church in America today is most of us fear the cure more than the illness. Most of us prefer the plausible lie that we cannot be cured to the fantastic truth that we can be. And here's the reason. If it's hell to be guilty or sick or hopeless or despairing, sorry, Bill, it's certainly scarier to be responsible, able to respond to God's visionary and creative love. If you and I could get through all the lame excuses about why we can't be healed and start to remember why we showed up in the first place, the attention and energy that our own broken and hurting selves constantly demand could instead be turned to the work of resurrection in the world. This is the miracle of healing that Jesus enacted at the pool in Bethesda that day, and that God's Spirit is surely enacting here if only we will participate. That you and I come to a beautiful place like this and encounter God. That you and I contribute to and participate in this strange experiment of building diverse and faithful gospel community. That you and I walk out of these doors, arms around each other, relationships healed. That our encounter with the gospel of Jesus Christ in this very place where we've come to be healed walks with us into this city and into the whole world, bringing hope and healing and resurrection. A miracle. A miracle. Church, hear the good news. You and I, we have been threatened with resurrection, invited into healing and hope. Will we go? People of God, please, no more lame excuses. Amen. Thank you.